that expectant up in the room, I might begin. I'm Lee Godden. I have the great pleasure to be the Dean of the Faculty of Law here. But this is very much an event that has come together through the hard work and collaborative efforts of a number of people. And so it's with great pleasure that I welcome Scott today, but I will not be doing the introduction. That pleasure will fall to other people. So today we have a wonderful topic for our lecture today: consumer data right, legal foundations to uphold inclusion, choice, and confidence in digital and data economies. And we can see from the people who come out on such a cold day that this is a topic of vital interest. I would just like to canvass the emergency procedures with you. In the case of fire, if the alarm sounds, leave the building through the nearest fire exit. And those exits are identified by green and white signs. Not that it will apply so much, but do not use the lifts. And fire assembly here is in Bunny Street. So that's that direction. Earthquake procedures are drop to the ground. And I know this is quite disconcerting for people from other jurisdictions and countries, but drop to the ground, get under cover and hold until the shaking stops, hoping the shaking stops. Stay inside until the shaking stops and it's safe to exit. Only evacuate if it is unsafe to remain. In the event of a tsunami, if there's a strong earthquake that makes it hard to stand or lasts for a minute or more, then evacuate to high ground. The safe area for a tsunami is in the parliamentary forecourt, which is very comforting. So that's just across the road and higher up that hill. So without further ado, if I could ask Martin to introduce and Simon to thank you.
Thank you, Lee. It's my name is Simon Jensen. It's my pleasure to introduce Scott today. But before doing so, I just thought I would explain why Scott is here. And it goes back to a conversation he and I had a number of months ago as I was preparing the reading materials for the course that I was doing, that I'm doing for Banking 352, and called Scott to say, look, have you got any suggestions for material I could include in the course material on open banking? Now, without recommending it, he pointed out that his book on banking on data had just been published. And somewhat flippantly, I said to him, well, maybe I could boost book sales by making it prescribed reading for the course. Scott's reaction, however, was almost the complete opposite. And he said to me, Simon, why don't I come out and lecture the course for you, or do the lecture for you? Something which he did this morning, and something which I think speaks to Scott's humble and generous nature. Words that I know don't typically associate with Australians, but perhaps evidence that there are such things as good Australians. So thank you, Scott, for doing that lecture this morning. Scott, I think also probably won't want me saying this, but Scott is, I think, probably unquestionably the global expert on consumer data right, having advised not just the Australian government, but the English government, the European Union, the Canadian government, the Japanese government, Hong Kong government, Singapore, Philippines, pro bono this week, the New Zealand government, because we can't afford. So I think without question, I haven't missed any, have I, Scott? Scott is the global expert on consumer data rights, so we're very lucky to have him here today. And Scott, no pressure.
He says no pressure, but I'm still reeling from the fact there could be a tsunami and an earthquake. So when I return the favour, Simon, and you come to give a lecture at the University of New South Wales, I'll give you the warning about taipans and Sydney funnel webs crawling across the stage. Thank you very much for having me here. I realise what a privilege it is, and despite Simon's jest, I'm very much aware that I am a visitor and a guest in your country. One of the important things I have learned in working in this field in different parts of the world is context. And one of the most important contexts in relation to data is culture. And you cannot carry legal frameworks without regard from one country to another, because if you do, you carry culture with it. There are large elements of that occurring. I find that actually occurring in relation to the transportation of privacy frameworks into nations to the north of us, which have collectivist cultures, rather individualistic cultures. And each place, I always start with, this has to work for you, your people, your cultures. It's got to speak to the way that you speak to each other. And in that question of context, it's also really important to understand that data sharing is not something new. It's something already occurring here and every other place that I work. It is in Australia, the analogy I use in trying to convince people that this is about something we have to improve for Australians rather than something we are giving to Australians. It's because Australians are already swimming in dangerous surf. They're already sharing data all the time, and half of Australians doing that don't even know they're at the beach. What this is designed to do in my country and in the other countries that I help is just to be a set of red and yellow flags where it is safer to swim. And who are the lifeguards? Who are the people who are going to look after those people? Because the alternative is we close the beach and the people just swim anyway. So that question of context, when you're considering this from a policy perspective, please keep in mind that I happen to know that there are so many New Zealanders who are already sharing their data and already giving up their online banking details to doing so. I don't make a comment on that, but the role of my government and my regulators is to help them out, not to leave them alone for themselves. So that question of context is also important. I am a lawyer and I've been a lawyer for a long time, and I do have a doctorate in law, but I am going to try to not mention any laws by name. I am qualified in the two jurisdictions I'm going to be speaking to, but I'm using those only as a benchmark for you to make your own decisions and to show you how we have been on a journey and what has been important in understanding in this field. So that's the context that I wanted to give you. I didn't expect that to happen. Did anyone else expect that to happen? I think it's fine. I just clicked on the wrong side. That was completely operator error. So wisely, I started with a map, said Tolkien, and I'm not nearly as good as him. Why is this here? You will find so many maps and so many reports by so many consultants about where is open banking in this world? Where is the consumer data right in this world? And it is really hard to get that accurate. This was accurate for approximately 60 seconds, and that is not a recent 60 seconds. This is showing the jurisdictions which have made efforts to introducing consumer data right to open banking, and the deepness of the colour shows the extent of the efforts. I am including New Zealand in a blue colour with most of the world actually, because those are the countries which are doing it with the assistance of regulation. I'm doing that only because you have legislation released for comment, which is in that way. Were it not for that legislation, I would have coloured you green, like the other countries which are relying solely on a market-based solution. What the evolving trend in many jurisdictions is a comment of the Bank for International Settlements some years ago now, saying this is just happening. It is interesting the discussions of this in other countries bring out that there is only one G7 nation which actually hasn't seriously started the ball rolling, which is Canada. They've been working on it for a number of years. So you are not at the edge of the frontier here. And what's important about that is we've made lots of mistakes already. And so you don't have to make those in doing what you choose to do. The red circle just means I'm here. So it changes in other places. So what are we talking about? Each time that you see part of these slides, which looks like it's been ripped from a book, it's because it's been ripped from my book. So that is the subtle way of saying where the information has come from. So after quite a bit of work for 7 years and trying to work out what this is because there is no set definition in any legislation in the world as to what a consumer data right is. And if there were, it would only apply to that jurisdiction anyway. We come to this solution, which is designed to explain it in a way which doesn't refer to technology, which doesn't refer to why you're doing it. It's trying to refer to what's actually happening from the customer's perspective. Sharing customer data as the customer directs for use as the customer desires. Why is the word banking crossed out? Is because if you want to say what is open banking, leave the word banking in. If you want to talk about a consumer data right, take the word banking out. Because in Australia, because we have energy already involved, it's sharing customer banking or energy data. When we add telecommunications, we'll add that in. It is really, people use open banking often to describe the extra part of sharing instructional information and not just factual information, so that you can actually initiate actions like payments. And the United Kingdom, we initiate payments through open banking. We can do it under, I was about to mention a law, sorry about that. We can do it in Europe too, under their directive, but it's not actually necessary, because from a technological level, that is only talking about the direction of the data flow, where it goes from one to the other. It is not talking about the core elements of you are sharing information. The reason I've got this other diagram is the area of data has more commercial terms and technological terms than legal terms, and these are all actually different things. What I look at as being the fundamental central point of a consumer data right is the fact that customers have autonomy to share information that is already shared with them. There is a means which actually makes that data easily portable, so it can be understood by the recipient. That makes it information and not just data. And there is accountability of the recipient for the use of that data, being the reason that the customer or consumer shared the information. This doesn't mean this has to be the definition you use. I like to use it because it aligns nicely with the functions that have to be performed. Sorry, I will come to questions at the end. So what I want to briefly go through, and I do recommend you consider these things in developing this in your jurisdiction. Why are you doing this? How are you going to get there? What is needed to do that? And then you can look back then and say, oh, this is why we're different to somewhere else. Analysis that starts from, oh, Australia is different because it does this, is not entirely, I mean, you can get to that point. The next question you're going to say, well, why? And that's a really, there's a number of great reasons you should do it differently to us, not just the mistakes I've made in developing our system. But I would recommend you start with why you're doing this and build it from the ground up, because that would mean it matches New Zealand's culture, the way that New Zealanders talk to New Zealanders, and that'll be really important to getting the participation to make this work. The foundations are largely legal. That's why this is a law lecture. You might think they're all technological. It's a law that supports the technology, and I'll come into how that is. Okay, so why is this done? Now, there's a few other jurisdictions I've spoken to, such as Brazil, Argentina, India, in my work with them. And largely I've come to these 4 reasons for doing it around the world. You're doing it because you want to increase competition in those underlying sectors, maybe banking to start with, because of the data bottleneck created in banking, because your bank has all your information, and actually to get a competitive service, you want to share it with someone else, and your bank is trained not to give away secrets. For all sorts of good reasons, like that's there, but that actually can affect competition, as you can imagine. You want to spur innovation because data is the fuel that really drives digital innovation. Understanding what is happening and why it's happening allows you to give a different means of doing things. But that's not the only reason. You can also be doing it for consumer protection because you are uncomfortable, for example, with people giving up their online banking details in order to share information. Maybe there should be a way that they can do that where they don't have to give up the power to enter into transactions on your behalf. And certainly a consumer data right or an open banking regime can do that through the API structure and the way the technology works. And the last one is inclusion. Clearly in countries like Brazil, Argentina, and mainly India, this is financial inclusion. People don't have bank accounts. They need to have bank accounts. It has been amazingly effective in India. It has been built from the Aadhaar digital identification framework, built up through the unified payment interface. It is astonishing. It is on a level similar to the removal of poverty in China, the sheer increase in financial inclusion in India. They would not call it open banking. They would start by calling it the India stack, and now they have a different phrase for it. But inclusion for people who are not currently included in finance is very powerful. In countries that actually don't have a significant issue there, it becomes digital inclusion. And that is, in my view, I've seen it, it's independent of your wealth, of your age, and of your culture, because you find all sorts of people that feel excluded from digital society more and more because they don't know how this works. And so you do these sorts of things to give them an easy way to engage with their transfers of valuable information. So you can see there, I've got another, and I've got a slide that says, well, some of that's to do with supply of services, some of that's to do with the demand of services, and some is the development of new things, and some of it is the improvement of old things. And in the bottom part, you can see how Australia and Britain matched up in the reasons they were doing this. You can see in both countries, we started with competition, innovation, a little bit of consumer protection because we're not really comfortable with screen scraping. But in both countries, since we've started to add more inclusion. One of the reasons that happens is because you realize that an ability for your citizens to safely transfer information forms a wonderful building block for a digital economy. If you add payments and digital identification to that, you then have a real platform for including a lot of your citizens in a digital society. It's a lot of work, but you can see that in the wording of the FCA, and you can see that in the wording of my Treasury. It starts to creep in as this is now talking about including more Australians in a digital economy. Again, totally up to you the way that you play with these different tools. The diagram would be different in India because it speaks to India's issues, not ours. Okay, so how would we do those things? If from a CDR perspective or a consumer data right or a customer data and product right perspective, I'll just use CDR from now on. What I have done and what we have done in Australia is worked out, well, for a start, let's treat this as a payment system for data because it's valuable information, and money now is just valuable information because very few of us have anything that's physical. And we have a wonderful system for transferring valuable information, and we have a great banking system where if you tell your bank you want your money paid somewhere, they just have to do it because that's part of the banker-customer contractual relationship. That works pretty well. It works so well that most people don't even know how those payment systems work. Tick. Like, you seriously don't want everyone in the country to know how a payment system works, so that means you must have a big problem with your payment system. So that ability of customers to be able to transfer their valuable information is not as clear in relation to the information related to the services they've been provided. Their banking data in banking, their energy information in energy. They've got it, it's on their bank statement, but it's really hard to get it across to someone other than as a letter or a PDF in a form which is easily processed by technology so they can be offered a really neat service in return. So that autonomy is about empowering customers to share the information they choose to share. And then we have, well, that autonomy is with the bank, so the data holder. And then we have, well, we need a portability and connectivity to be able to transfer it to the person that the customer has chosen to trust. And they're important words. We're not telling you to do this, but if you've chosen to trust this person with your information, and we know you're already swimming at the beach because you're trusting all sorts of people with information, but in this system, if you want to transfer information to someone to offer you a better service, we'll give you not only the right to do it, we'll give you the means to do it. Now, in my information, Commissioner has referred to the, desperately trying to avoid mentioning any legislation, the European privacy legislation gives you portability without a pathway. So what I'm going to say, PSD2, which is not that, what open banking, what our consumer data right does is provides the technological pathway and not just the portability. And that's where the technology really comes in. It also provides the connectivity so that you know who's you can transfer that data to. They go together. And if any of you are involved in payments, and I know a lot of you are, that connectivity of participants is critical to the stability of the system. That's also important for information. Lastly, and not least importantly at all, accountability. When it goes across to someone, The promises they've made as to how they are going to use your data have to be fulfilled. And there should be a means of making sure that even though you've chosen to trust them, that they themselves are trustworthy. So that's why you have an accreditation framework. So you have these three things moving together, which allow you to choose whether you want competition, innovation, all of them, mainly inclusion. You just move these dials up and down and you can do that. Now, I've got another slide there, which refers to a really bit of a balance. I'll let you in on a secret. That is a slide I used to use when I taught lectures in banking and payments. It used to say that there is a cost and risk trade-off when you're designing any kind of payment system, and you have to choose where you want to be on this scale. You can't have something being both incredibly cheap and incredibly safe. That's not the way the world works. You actually have a balance here. And the same things happens in consumer data right frameworks. I'll be speaking to the need to balance what you want in this. If you want everything, you end up getting nothing, because the most safe system is don't let people share their data. That's closing the beach, swim where you like, because they're still swimming and doing it. So what this shows is that if you want to increase portability, you often have to actually work out that accountability is not going to be as high. So you probably want to be somewhere on that slope. You want more people to participate, but I don't want those people to participate because they can't be trusted. Well, you can't have both. You can't have everyone can play, but no one can play. So that's just a side chain. You balance these things. You can't have everything. You're probably wondering right now, why is this a law lecture? But I'll get to that. Okay, and this is where you get to that. So they're the functions you need to get the objectives that you want. What foundations do you have to lay down to do that? You need, I'll start with technology. This is a technological framework. Most people would say it's all about the technology. It's all about the API, application programming interface, the little plug that allows you to plug into a new machine, plug two machines together. It's a bit like a waiter that can pull different things from the kitchen, depending on the menu that you pick out. In some places, like Hong Kong and Singapore, it is so dependent on that, it is referred to only as an open API framework. They are primarily technological frameworks. They do not have as much legal law and regulation behind them. You can see there, I've actually got a box showing how all these things work, and you can see the box is smaller for the two little boxes which have the flags of Hong Kong and Singapore. That is just relative. Please don't measure that when you get the slides and think that Scott is making some reference to the actual sizes. But in addition to that, you have rules, enforceable rules, like the rule that you can share your data. That's not just a technological framework, that is a rule. So if you really want the right to share data, if you really want to be able to make payments from your account, you really need to have a legal right for it, because what are you going to do if they don't? And we've certainly learned that over the last 10 years with all sorts of areas of fintech, is the technology only works until it doesn't. And then you do head back to the law to make sure that you can get what you expected. And we do find that in areas where we thought that the technology was trying to escape the law, and it's very hard to escape the law. The last bit is regulated participation. So to what extent do you regulate the participation in the system? And regulation is slightly different from the enforceable rules. Regulation is to law what technology is to science. It's effectively an application of the law, but they do need to work together in the design of the system. And you can see there in the boxes, Australia and the United Kingdom are quite similar in the end result, in the way they do it differently. But those three dimensions, Hong Kong and Singapore, without the legal support and without the regulation of participation, produce a different result. That could be fine. That might work just fine for the cultures in those places. And importantly, in those countries, there is a compliance culture which doesn't necessarily require, in all circumstances, a rule. They might just do it because they've been told it's a good thing to do by someone in authority. That's fine for that culture. So I'm not saying that those boxes, I mean, if anything, it says more about the fact that Australians won't do things unless they're told to, in which case they'll do anything else. I am sure the New Zealand box will totally reflect, I'm sure you do whatever you're told in this country. That's right, isn't it, Simon? Yeah, sure. At the bottom, there is a description of a CDR system. So I've given you a description of CDR, or open banking, but what about a system? You can see that bottom definition is exactly the same as the original one, except it refers to a system of rules and technology. What I'd like you to take from that is it's not one system running off one database by one big company. It's a combination of the rules and the technology run by everyone. We're using a common language, the standardization, to make this work, but it is a network that we are doing here, just like payments started, where we had, when clearing started, people in a coffee house exchanging pieces of paper. And finally, that's exactly where we are with the most technologically advanced value we have, this thing called information. We find it hard to even, very hard to value, but we are way back as if it were pieces of paper in a coffee house, because we don't have the really great technological systems to deal with all of the issues in information itself. And that's certainly how people would see it from a banking, payments, and clearing perspective. Okay. So what are the legal foundations? Oh, dang, I am going to refer to laws. What are the legal foundations that can do this? And I've just got an example here, which is the way that the UK and the Australian system fit together in a pyramid. And you can see there is a difference, and that's because they have a different history. The European Union had a directive, PSD2, and now PSD3 is out there for consultation, PSD2, which United Kingdom needed to implement because it was part of the European Union. The key to understanding open banking in the United Kingdom is the P in PSD2, or the P in the Payment Services Regulation. It's payment. It's a data framework which was designed to hang off payments. That's the scope that they had. It was, and in addition to that regulation, there was an investigation by their competition regulator, which said we want more competition in current accounts and some transaction accounts, not mortgages, not loans. And so the British system is confined by that. And so you have these things working together, and then you have the privacy legislation. UK GDPR is just the carryover of GDPR, especially post-Brexit. On top of that, you have their standards. There is a reason that the triangle for the UK on standards is bigger than the triangle in Australia. That is relative, because standards perform a much bigger role in the UK because they're missing something from the left-hand triangle, and that is the rules. In Australia, we have a law made by our parliament. We have an act of our minister to say, this is in, banking is in, and energy is in, and it will shortly say non-bank lending is in. And then we have rules from our regulator. Well, they were originally from our regulator, and now they're actually from our Treasury, which can be adjusted quite easily. We're on to the 6th iteration of those rules because we've learned so much in the process. But even they don't go into technological detail. Then we have the data standards, and that all fits under one legal structure. And for example, those data standards form a legal contract between every participant in the same way as the rules of the Australian Securities Exchange form a legal contract between every participant, i.e. by force of law, because it's too important for, from our perspective to not have that in place, and I'll come to why. So they are different frameworks, different starting points. When I started this process for the Australian government, I was not told I need to punish banks for the financial crisis. I was told there's a Productivity Commission report that says data is an incredibly valuable resource in Australia, and we're not getting that value to Australians. We need a consumer data right. We also saw open banking, and then the Treasurer, who became the Prime Minister, said, could you please make those work together? And here's 4 months, so create everything for that. Thank you very much, and see me before Christmas, Scott. So what is the substance of those legal, and I'm a banking lawyer traditionally, and so that's why you see so much banking of data sitting in there. What is the substance of the legal foundations? I'm not going to go through each one of those. I'll just mention actually in passing how we work these out in Australia. But you can see there how what I've started with in being the functions being performed and how they lead into the legal issues. Why have I done that? Because it is, if you start this process, there are so many legal issues that can be thrown at you. And certainly when I started this process, I started a consultation, and a number of people didn't want this in Australia. You can imagine who they were. And they would try and confuse the heck out of me, both on technology and then on legal issues. And so there had to be a way of actually putting these together in a framework so I could have a meaningful discussion with people. And so, and this has worked in a couple of jurisdictions. The rights to share data, that's a legal right to share data. That gives the autonomy, so empowers the customer. The responsibilities for shared data. i.e. you're going to do what you have promised you're going to do, otherwise there are going to be consequences. Those consequences are different for data than money. It doesn't matter how much money you've got. There are some breaches with data which just cannot be satisfied by money. You actually need to repair the damage, not just give someone money. To give you an example, if someone has lost their identity and you give them $50, they still can't open a bank account to put the $50 in. So you actually need concerted work to re-establish what has been lost. That can be done if you have participation of lots of people with the means of doing that, the participants in the system. My country has had a couple of alarmingly large cybersecurity issues in the last year, and we have found that a similar response to a financial crisis is required, where you need actually cooperation from a range of entities to actually put things back together, and not just we'll pay you out, for example. And probably the one that is missed until something goes horribly, horribly wrong like that is you need those relationships, those legal relationships that allow you to take the actions that you expect. If you only have a technological framework, you can actually miss the point that these people are in a relationship together and they're counting on each other to perform their obligations under the system. If I move it use a different word, and this works really well in any consumer data right, take the word data out and put the word money in and see what you think. Okay, so we've got a money system, a payment system, and some money has gone missing, and that's because one person actually had what is called a fat finger problem and typed in the wrong thing from an organization. Okay, well, we have pretty clear rules about they've got to find the money because it was their fault. Okay, is that just a moral obligation? No, that's written into the rules, and there is a legal obligation to do that. And if they don't do that, it'll be lawyers at 20 paces, and we will make this happen. Do we always do that? In my experience, in 30 years of practice, you never need to get the lawyers involved because you know you can. But all that is because of the fact the legal obligations are there and the legal relationships are there. I'm not talking about customer compensation. That is an important issue, but actually legal obligations between the participants is really important. And the last one is a critical issue because I'll just explain it briefly. The element of trust in a consumer data framework or an open banking framework is even more acute than in a financial system or a payment framework. And the reason for that is because you cannot ever be really sure that when someone has promised they will only use information in one particular way, that they have. There is no settlement asset in this settlement system. Money is fungible. You've lost my $20, you give me $20, I'm pretty okay with that. I don't need my original $20. You've shared my information with someone you shouldn't have, and now I've got a world of hurt. No, I'm now starting to mistrust you. And actually, no, I'm starting to mistrust the system unless the regulators can help this out. And then people talk to each other, and then the things starts to collapse in trust because no one can go to their bank and say, show me my $20. In time, we will have the technology or the application of technology that allows the promises made with respect to information to go with that information. The technology exists, but we haven't been able to add that to data so that data acts like a smart contract, for example. Until we get there, it's like the credit risk in a data framework. If you're from a banking background, what the credit risk is simply the risk that you won't fulfill your promises with money. The credit risk in a data framework is someone doesn't fulfill their responsibilities, their privacy responsibilities. The difference is a capital requirement is not quite good enough when I just want you to solve my problem. So you can see there on the right, I've got examples of issues, and they are issues that we use all the time in finance systems in order to solve these problems. I've just translated them to a data framework. I'm going to go through a few of them right now to show how the balance works in Australia, in the UK. These are not the only issues. The reason I've particularly singled out these issues is these are issues where you can see either a clear difference in the way that different frameworks work or the way that data works and money. So they're the really interesting ones. I'd be delighted if over time, you guys could show me where I have missed some issues, because actually a part of this process is we need to learn from you, because no one has really done this before. And I have been helped enormously by the United Kingdom when they told me what not to do. And certainly I've passed that on to the other jurisdictions I've work with. Because we have an iterative system, when we see you doing something better, we will be changing our system to make sure that we can take advantage of your thinking. So please tell me when I've got this wrong, because I do get lots of things wrong. Okay, what's an example of that? The legal rights to share data, supplying data and sharing data. Again, this is only supposed to be representative. The sizes don't matter. You can see 2 flags there, and you can see a white box. The white box is a common law of banking and payments. So when it's money. The good thing about this analysis is the common law of banking and payments is pretty much identical in the United Kingdom and Australia. So there's no basis risk there. But if you say, this is what we do with data, this is what we do with money, how is it different? What you can see from the first slide is that we have many more accounts in Australia. We have also something called reciprocity, which theoretically, because we haven't kicked in fully yet, expands the amount of data available, because it ropes in people who are in the system to receive data to also share it as well. It's a very customer-focused principle. We have had to relax it quite a bit to get people into our system. But the broader account coverage means that Australians have more autonomy to share their data because there's more data that they can share. Now, you can't criticize United Kingdom for that. Their laws didn't go that far. They've been trying to fix that up for quite some time. And indeed, the FCA is doing that with its open finance proposals now. But it shows how the legal foundation constrained the scope of what they could do. And that's where lawyers should be, in that legal foundation. It's not a technological issue. They can totally do the tech, but they don't have the legal foundation to give people the right and then to protect people when they share that data. That's the other thing, is if you follow all the rules, you need to be protected to make sure no one has a go at you for following all the rules. The next one about sharing data, neither Australia nor the United Kingdom have got their head around allowing customers to share data with themselves. We always use a third party. The Australian law does allow it. We just can't get our head around it at the moment because we're concerned that someone will convince a lot of people to just escape the system by doing it. The other side is, though, I mean, why shouldn't we let people use their own software to deal with information that they have? I mean, like there is a real issue there. And if you looked at one of the statutory reports in Australia, I've struggled with my reports, and a statutory report has said, we'd like to do this, we just need to solve this issue. But you can see how it's different there to money. Yeah, I'm going to just draw the money out of a bank account. That's fine. Sweet. You can't stop that. And we would say, if you could, well, what is going on? That's my right. The other thing is the autonomy in Australia is supported by those rules. They are understandable not only by lawyers, but by real people who speak English, for example. And the standards, both in Australia and the United Kingdom, take a little bit of work. And so the clarity provided by the CDR rules does support the legal autonomy of Australians. Again, I'm deliberately not commenting on your system, although your system does some really good things, I think. Okay, where else does this play out? And I'll be finishing soon for questions, so don't, if you're getting bored, just hang in there. The legal responsibilities for shared data. Okay, now this is really interesting. There probably are some people in the room who are saying, well, you know, surely the privacy legislation is kind of similar. Yeah, it is. In fact, Australia and the UK are pretty aligned in relation to consent requirements. You can only use data in a way that's been agreed, which doesn't apply to money. Because if a bank could only use the money you deposit with it as you want it to, that's kind of not banking anymore the way we know it. And why is that necessary? That's a fundamental difference between money and data. It's because all they've promised to do is give you a sum of money back. They haven't promised to give you your data back. They're not giving the same notes back. And so, but that's fine. We just have to be aware of the fact that that is one of those differences where the valuable information actually is a different characteristic. Data minimization doesn't apply in banking. It does apply in both systems. And that's really important for that trust. Please don't ask for more data than you need for what you promised. It's one of those things we can actually start to benchmark. Why did you ask for all of that? Because you didn't need it. It gets around the fact of it's hard to prove there's no settlement asset you can deliver. Preserving the value of the data. This is something where we're talking about how do we make sure it stays accurate? How do we make sure that it doesn't escape the system? And you can see here two differences, both Australia and United Kingdom, because they don't let the customer have their data directly, the customer can't check what the data is in its technological format. They know what the original form is, but actually one of the best checks and balances in a data framework is the customer. They've got the vested interest. I know we shouldn't be relying on them, but they can totally help by saying that's not right. And so the value of the data is not correct. In Australia, we have an obligation to delete data when participation ceases. We kind of had something similar in our privacy legislation anyway. This was required as part of our parliamentary process, and it was taken from GDPR, the European privacy legislation. The obligation to delete data is quite similar to repaying money. Because you can't actually repay data because you've still got it. The idea of you've got your deposit back is quite similar to I've deleted your data because all the value is now with you. I haven't got any of the value. And that's why I make that analogy with the credit risk. If you want to head down that path of how all these risks translate from money to data, it's in chapter 3 of my book, but I am not here, as Simon said, to sell my book. It's just a little bit bankerish, and you might not want to hear me say that. The last comparison, before I go briefly into trust before stopping for questions, the legal relationships for sharing data. Now, this is really important and slightly boring sometimes when you're at the start of this process. What drives success of a CDR open banking system are people participating, because what drives outcomes are businesses offering alternatives to real people. The outcome doesn't come from the regulation. The outcome comes from facilitating the recipients, who are businesses, offering better services to the real people or the small businesses that you choose to include in your system, which means you need participation. And that's why everything is a balance. It can't be only banks can participate because, well, that just means we're sharing banking data with banks. You probably don't want it to be anyone who has a New Zealand shareholder can be involved in the system, because now how do I know the promises are all worthwhile? What is the answer? You get to choose that. There's lots of tools that you can use, and the tools that you can use if you're concerned about it is look at all of your financial system, take the word money out, put the word data in and say, do I want that? Because you've already tested that so many times. And that drove a lot of my work, because our financial system in Australia survived the financial crisis. I was deeply involved before and after on that. And the regulation system was road tested and actually stress tested. And so I hauled all that over because we haven't had a data crisis yet. But it would be great if I used financial risk reasoning in doing that. I've already spoken to liability for data sharing. You can see there that Australia has legally enforceable relationships. United Kingdom doesn't yet. You can see there that we have very clear liability relationships. So all the participants know when they're on the hook and when they're off the hook. If you're from a banking background, you might say, well, that's absolutely essential because I need to know what the risk is to invest into it. I understand it may not be what I would like it to be, but if I know what it is, then I can actually manage that risk. So that's why certainty is very important. And lastly, you can see what all the systems miss is deposit protection arrangements, because quite frankly, we just can't give you your data back because it's gone. So the idea of, don't worry, the government will give you your money back if you, actually, I think, I'm not sure you have it. Do you have deposit protection? Yeah, okay, so we do have it. And we got it in 1 week before the financial crisis. That was a spot of luck, wasn't it? It was a bit stressful, right? The deposit protection rates, don't worry, the first the first $250,000 will be protected by the state. We'll hand you your money back. Okay, you're gonna hand me my data back? Like, well, where are you gonna get it from? And so that's another area it doesn't trend. You do something else, but it doesn't quite work. It's quite good for accountability in banking. I'm going to leave this slide here with you. All of this produces different features. You will work out what that box looks like for New Zealand, but I would hope you do it from what you want how you want to do it, and the legal foundations, rather than starting with this box and trying to go backwards. If you are a lawyer, you totally want to start at the law and then go forwards, and then you can engineer the outcome that your society requires. My personal view is that is a fundamental role of lawyers, be they public lawyers or private lawyers. You can also see the difference in the two boxes for Australia. Last slide. I'd like you to look at the gears. You can tell I drew every one of these diagrams because they're not really that great. And this one looks totally like it came out of Microsoft PowerPoint. But what this is designed to say, and this comes from Steve, you had Rachel Botsman speak at The Point last year. I already was using Rachel's research in my doctorate, and Rachel had presented this trust stack, and it was very effective. She's very clear about it at your conference. That stack actually works brilliantly in a consumer data right arrangement. It works great in any fintech application. This also works in digital assets as well. This idea about having confidence in the concept, having confidence in the participants, and having confidence in the system. They are actually separate things, but they all gear up together and they all wind down together. And so it's not just the case that we've only got safe people involved. Also, we need to know, actually, I do believe that actually sharing data will produce benefits. Also, I do believe in the system, the framework the state has created to allow this to happen, so that in times of stress, the gears halt. And that is hard work. It's hard work in finance. It is even more hard work in creating a new network now. But trust is, as I mentioned earlier, drives these framework success even more than in finance, because we're in a kind of a new world here. We haven't got 500 years of banking to lean on where we know the money's going to get to where it needs to be. The last, the words that I have there, that is actually from my book, but it is a consolidating all of the policy work I've done over the years as to what the foundations should be. I always have had very much a customer focus, in that the customer's got to be able to make choices. It's got to be able to derive value. It's got to be able to be encouraged to look after that value, because that's important too. And like working out when you should be going swimming at the beach and when you shouldn't. And also enable trust in the system in respect to their data. The reason that's so important is, as a fundamental linchpin of a digital economy, I think every jurisdiction can benefit from lifting up the awareness of the citizens as to both the value and risks of information. And it is something that I think a lot of people will learn if they can extract that value and actually, once they know their data is valuable, actually treat it as being valuable. So I'm going to finish there for questions. Hopefully that hasn't been too boring for you. I'm sorry if it's been finance related. I'm also sorry if it's not legal enough, but I wanted to draw a lot of whole things together. So I don't know how you do questions here, but fire away.
Thank you very much. I think it's on. Yeah. Thank you very much. You got the balance right between too much finance or too much law and so on. Thank you for this. I'm interested in the that cooperation to put things back together, quoting you in terms of after the identity theft, because we are thinking here in New Zealand about actually how to make this system more secure, and actually how do you envisage that sort of cooperation? What we should do to be able to give back as much as it's possible to consumer or customer who lost his or her data?
This, in my personal view, is super important. And it's the way that we'll build trust in all sorts of part of a digital economy. There's a couple of stepping stones in this. We have learned already that the way you rapidly solve things is cooperation between entities. They could be telecommunications providers, they could be banks, they could be insurance companies, and there can be issues actually when in natural disasters around this area if they occur at the same time as a cyber attack. And one of the interesting things that we found already, and this is not in a CDR context, just a broader data is super valuable and oh my goodness, the world is changing context, is I'll say people like me, lawyers, sometimes get in the way because we are annoying and point out, if you actually do that, you could become liable too. And so that doesn't happen when you save a payment system or heaven forbid, a global clearing system, because we already have rules saying when the music stops, this is what you do, not what you can do, what you must do. And because that is backed by laws, you are protected from liability in trying to save the system. So one thing is make sure the first 2 days is not spent with lawyers working out how we can even let people help. The second thing is create a framework where you quickly jump to the sharing of information with the right people. You probably had it, we had it in Australia, is once we had the financial crisis, all of a sudden we're all working together to try and make sure we kept everything. That sharing of information was brilliant. We do need in Australia to do the same thing in payments going forwards, because the changes in payments are things that we just don't understand. And there'll be something that not the state on its own, no company on its own can deal with. So we need a framework so that there can be an easy conversation with all sorts of knowledge disciplines, scientists, engineers, lawyers, policymakers, economists, business people, to work out what is the quick solution we need. Then the next hardest thing, and this has always been my problem in payments in the work I've done in Australia, is how do we provide the tools for that, not the tools to stop getting in the way, but the tools to make it happen when we don't even know what the problem is. I think that we will find a lot of those tools as we complete our work in digital identification, because a lot of this does relate to the ability to still be Scott in all my relationships, not in a relationship with the state. But if we have a digital identification framework, my state can help me become Scott again rather quickly. There are all sorts of other decisions that you make in doing this. For example, how tightly you bind the way you authenticate yourself to things which can't change, like your biometrics. And because then you have an issue of, if someone steals my biometrics, I can't prove I'm Scott anymore, and it doesn't really matter. And so you have these issues about not making the system so tight. You've got to have ways of actually helping the person and not just relying on technology. So Martin, what I've given you there is a classic lawyer's answer, because I haven't given you the exact solution, but it really is make sure we can do something. Make sure you put people together so we can find something to do. And as best you can, put the tools in advance there so you don't need a new act of parliament to solve the problem. Gosh, I hope there's no more questions as hard as that one. Who's got the microphone?
Thank you. I'm just interested to get your opinion on where you see this sitting with, say, government. And the example is government holding an individual's data. And then also the example of where SWIFT was weaponized.
It's going to be a long night, isn't it? Interestingly, it's always been the Australian government's policy, even regardless of the change of government, that the government is itself a data holder, and the system will, and the government, there's all sorts of parts of the Australian government are very keen to provide that data. The system has been designed to not put the government in the middle of everything, because that doesn't quite work with Australian culture, in the sense of we don't want to share all of our banking data, all of our telco data, all these other things directly with the government, unless there's a reason for that. And we will make the choice as to with whom we will choose to trust with our information. Interestingly, when you get to start to consider this with sectors where there is a strong state involvement, like health, where there are such great benefits and such deep worries about it being used, you end up trying to work out what the balance really should be with that. I'm sure your country is like mine. There are such very tight constraints on the use of health information. Okay, I'm not making that comment. Like I say, in my country, there is very tight constraints in the use of health information. When you use this in each sector, we have this basic rule of working out what's already there. Why is that there? rather than just dismantling it or just accepting it. What this does in each sector you apply it to, it shines a bright light on, do we already use data appropriately for the benefit of the consumer, patient, or customer? The second part of the question, you've referred to SWIFT and the actions taken in relation to the Ukraine. This is not just these issues are no longer just issues about a consumer's privacy or even the duties of confidence or even just private relationships. So there is always now a greater policy element to this than there ever used to be. There was information published in Australia which suggested that the people involved in the cybersecurity issues we had last year may have been sovereign states and not actually individuals. That means really, in my view, is you need a broad conversation of this. These things, valuable information is no longer an issue which is only dealt with in one policy framework. And I draw your attention to that. My work with the Australian government in recommending changes to the way we regulate and structure payments in Australia was basically, you can see I made if you did want to look at it, you can see I make a recommendation that the central bank, of which I'm a board member, doesn't actually have the scope to deal with every possible issue in payments, because some of those things are beyond the scope of my central bank's structure. They're beyond competition, beyond efficiency, beyond stability. They could be consumer protection. They could be sovereignty of the country itself. There could be a national interest. So the recommendation, which does seem to be about to be implemented, is actually we need an ability for the treasurer, him or herself, to make decisions to actually use that power, because there are broader issues at stake for Australia than just the issues that my central bank is responsible for. I can only finish by saying it seems that that way the world is, and my view is we probably just need to enable Australia to deal with that rather than to pretend that they can't deal with it. Really good question, but these are getting harder each time. Please go for it.
Hi there, thank you very much. One of the most controversial issues in the last 10 years has been about customer authorised transactions where they turn out to be a scam. And we've now settled on I hope settled on the view that the bank isn't liable. In your appreciation, has any jurisdiction done a good job of heading off that issue so that we're not battling that for data breaches for the next 10 years about who's responsible if a customer authorises a data scam?
Okay, well, I'll try. Tell me if I've got this right. And so, is there any jurisdiction who have got to the point of saying the starting point is not that if something goes wrong, it's the bank's fault? And that is for all sorts of reasons across the world, the fact in relation to a lot of payments. It is built into an EFT code of conduct or those sorts of things. The rule in Australia is that the bank is not at fault. Yes, we did that. Why did we do that? Is because it could be a bank on the other side. So the data holder might be a little fintech, and it could be Apple on the other side if we ever extended a technology. So part of my work in this involved me being reviewed by Ben Giver, and he has a good analysis of this in his book on payments, and he explains why we have this system of the bank being liable in relation to payments and why we put that into place for electronic funds transfers when they were called electronic funds transfers. A lot of that reasoning doesn't hold in a information framework where actually the bank is receiving the data because they're offering the competitive product, or there's not a bank involved at all. And so if you have in that triangle, the customer will always treat as being the person we need to look after. The two people at the bottom of the triangle, the recipient and the holder, you can't assume that one is the big baddie and one is the little innovative thing that is trying to make things better. They could be switched. They both could be big baddies. Please don't quote me on big baddies. God dang, and that's on the video now. It's even that logic of why you do that doesn't quite work if you have a consumer data rights scope, because you can't assume that the person that has the data actually has the financial wherewithal to compensate everyone. And that line of reasoning, when you look at where it came from a world where we had banking payment systems, not payment ecosystems, where always there was a bank at one end of the chain. I just don't think that that's the world that we're going to have in 5 years' time, maybe 2 years' time. Yes, and we have not had, we've that's in our rules, so we don't have it's always the bank, the customer that compensates the customer, but our payments rules still work the way they always did. And we are going to have to look at that also in circumstances where there is no bank in our payment system, because at that point, that framework just fails to help anyone. So really good question. But I haven't got an answer to say, oh, we always get this person, but our liability framework does say the person who made the mistake is liable. That's not always good enough to compensate the customer, because what if they've gone insolvent, for example? But the starting point of, we'll always assume the bank is there. We can't assume that for data because maybe there is no bank there. By the way, please feel free to leave, right? I get this has already gone on. I can't leave, but you guys totally can.
So
Thank you for that thing.
just keen for a quick comment on, say, the US system and the data sharing and stuff that goes on in that jurisdiction, because it seems sort of very laissez-faire. And if I've interpreted your framework correctly, it scores very low on a lot of those metrics, yet has incredibly high levels of usage and a lot of kind of outcomes from the system. Are they just kind of swimming at a beach with no lifeguards, or is it an example of the market creating frameworks? You know,
great question. And the reason the US was light blue is they've actually started to implement section 1. I'm going to explain a law now. 103.0 of the Dodd-Frank Act. For anyone who's in financial markets, that was the one that just never got activated. But that is a consumer data right, the right to share data. Maybe you know that already. But of course, data sharing has been occurring quite a lot in the US already. And they don't really have privacy legislation across the country either. We're in California and a couple other places. That is, in my view, a reflection of the culture that has developed around those laws and the use of information in the United States. All I can say is it's obviously not the framework I recommended for my country, because it was inconsistent with the way that we treat these sorts of things. It can be highly effective at getting participation and innovation, but you saw those graphs where I balanced lots of things. You can't have them all, right? So some of those things, the US would be right at the top, and then it would not have anything here, because perhaps in some circumstances, accountability will be very difficult in circumstances where it was just anyone who received the information. There are other countries that work in other ways where all information is, for example, shared with the state. That works in that particular culture. But, you know, so that's why I really rush to say, please, it's up to you. You could just take the US system and plonk it down here, but please also ask yourself, are you the US in doing that? And the way that their regulators are working with that, it's the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. It's actually a long process because of the fact there is so much already going on, which is why I'm actually quite delighted that New Zealand is working on this now, because it's so much harder to do it in 10 years' time when a lot of these practices might have become entrenched. Last question down here, please.
Hey, thank you for that. I'm actually building on that point, since I suspect a lot of the participants in the New Zealand market will be Australians. How high is the regulatory bar for regulating participants? And are we saving people from themselves? Better to have them inside the tent than out. If I really, really, really want to give my data to that tech bro startup, should I be allowed to?
What we have done in Australia, and this is one of the things I'd suggest, we have been able to take advantage of the flexibility in our structure to give a really high point and then keep dialing it down, as we realized that the high point we started with, which was kind of like only trained lifeguards can swim at the beach. We had to dial it down, and we even dialed it down further Friday 1 week ago, where we said that business data can escape from our system with the right business consent. And by the way, small businesses have proven to be the engine room of open banking in the UK, and actually are going to be the engine room in Australia as well, because there is a lot of productivity benefit for those businesses if they can use technological tools to give them more time. So the answer to that question is, do I think we have reached the final spot? No, because this is going to be a quote, but I don't want this to be a quote. Just pretend you were lifting interest rates to try and stop inflation. You're kind of just trying to test it as you go up and work out the right spot, because there's no book that tells you what to do in this world. We're testing the same thing. The interesting thing is, as the system runs, people are prepared to take more risks on it because all those wheels are dialing up. And so they say, well, actually, I do understand what this is for. And I do get that the ACCC is sitting there, as well as Treasury, as well as the Privacy Commissioner. So actually, if you dial that one down a bit, the others won't spin so fast. But did I know that 7 years ago when I started? No, but I did know that a risk-based regime, which was graduated, worked really well in finance. And that was my original recommendation, is we don't just have one level of authorization, we have lots. But if you've been involved in implementing policy into regulation, that's a lot of hard work to do it from the start. And so that's why we had this journey. That's another brilliant question, because you need that participation, but you also need people to have confidence so they will participate. And you probably be able to work out which benchmarks you would use in New Zealand to say, well, this is just like this. So you don't need to worry, this is as safe as this. And one of the words I used with the Canadian government, with Nass Senate, the phrases, and it seems to have echoed because they kept printing it. It's not about the red and yellow flags, but they did use that. This really needs to be worked so that the movement of customer banking information is as effective and is as safe as moving of customer banking funds. And if you get to that point, because banking funds move so quickly, that people are comfortable with the risk-return trade-off, it'll work just fine. The trouble is, data has a different perception in customers' minds and in society's minds. And that's why we kind of take an iterative journey. Well, that's the best we can do. If you can beat that, we will do whatever you do. But we're just trying to find our way. Great question. I'm going to be outside. If you guys want to hassle me with more questions, knock yourself out. But it's been, I'm going to hand over to someone. Before I hand over to someone, thank you very much for listening to me and not leaving. And thank you very much for not making fun of my accent. So thank you.
Well, in the name of the organizers, can you please join us on networking even afterwards to have a drink? Thank you.